Sarkle. I am the coordinator of the Free to Be Women's Group here at St. Tim's, and tonight's presentation is being hosted by the ladies of Free to Be. In our planning committees, after we had Father in 2019, all the women said is we want more. We want more Father Robert Spitzer, so here he is tonight. Father Spitzer is a very accomplished man. When I went to print out some information about him tonight, there were 12 pages on the website. So I'm going to give you a few highlights of this incredible man's life. Father Robert Spitzer is a Jesuit Catholic priest ordained in 1983. He holds many academic degrees, including a BA from Gonzaga University, an MA from St. Louis University, an MDiv from the Gregorian University in Rome, a THM from Weston School of Theology, and a PhD from the Catholic University of the America. After each one of those titles are either the words summa cum laude or magna cum laude. So he is the best of the best. Father Spitzer has been a professor. He was the president of Gonzaga University. He is the founder of the Magis Institute. He is a world-famous speaker and lecturer. He's made many TV appearances to discuss both science and theology. He's also the author of 12 books, and I'm certain there are many more to come. But what I admire most about Father Spitzer is his loving spirit. He is a theologian and a scientist, yet he always speaks in a way that we mere mortals can understand him. He is a gentleman, kind, and very generous with his time. In the back of the church, you will find donation baskets for Father Spitzer to thank him for his presence here tonight and to support his work at the Magis Institute. So Father Spitzer, everyone's gathered for you. Father Robert Spitzer.
Thank you. Got it now. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I'm just honored to have such a nice crowd here tonight. And of course, it's Easter, and I will be talking about the resurrection. And believe it or not, there is some scientific access to Jesus' resurrection and glory that we'll be talking about later on in the evening. In the second half, we'll look at the evidence for the resurrection and the image formation on the shroud. For the moment, though, I am going to go through a whole lot of things, which I need to do preliminarily because, of course, of that 1988 carbon dating that has, of course, been debunked, but I want you to know why it was debunked and how, and a variety of other things about the blood stains, which, of course, are periodically thrown into question when, in fact, there should be no question whatsoever about them. And finally, we get to the whole coordination of the crucifixion event, the unique crucifixion event described in the Gospels with the medical evidence that's on the Shroud of Turin, and the most fascinating evidence of all, the evidence of the resurrection that is emblazoned in the image that we're going to be describing tonight. It truly is a fascinating thing. I'd ask you, if you really want to know the journey that the shroud took, that we can tell from the pollen fossils and from the iconographic evidence, let's save those for the Q&A, because trying to put this together in 1 hour will be a challenge. And so let us begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Heavenly Father, you know we are rational beings, scientific beings, beings that want to plumb the mysteries of the universe, and you have given us all the evidence we could possibly ask for, never wanting to leave us bereft of the reason that complements faith and the faith that complements reason, so that we might see you not only rationally, intellectually, mathematically, but also lovingly and in your goodness and your beauty. We ask that we might see this with an ever more penetrating glance and depth, and through all of that, to come to know you even better in the resurrection we celebrate in this season through Jesus our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, and St. Anselm, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, the Shroud of Turin, many of you have heard, is a burial cloth. It's 14 feet long. It's constituted by a very expensive linen, which was woven seemingly in the first century, but we have to prove that. It has a series of blood stains on it, 346 of them. Those blood stains, as we'll talk about, are very much whole human blood, has, of course, the DNA constituents there, AB positive blood type, and so forth. So we'll talk about all of these things momentarily, but there's an image on the shroud as well. And the image, as we will talk about and describe in some detail in a moment, is a perfect three-dimensional. So the interior of the body is also there, the bones on the inside, but it's three-dimensional imaging like an MRI. And that three-dimensional imaging shows you the depth of not only the bones in the inside, the bones in the fingers compared to the flesh that surrounds them, but also it has actual layering and we'll talk about how this layering occurred like an MRI. In just a moment. It is a photographic negative image. So as you're looking at some of these pictures up there, that straw yellow, sort of sepia-colored picture, there is actually what you would see if you went to the shroud exhibit in Turin when the shroud is exposed. You would see that image, a kind of a faint sepia-colored image, and you probably would think not much of it. You would certainly notice the blood, and you would think something of that. But then when Secundo Pia, way back over 100 years ago now, took a picture of that and looked at the image, what he saw was, well, maybe the next picture down there is that wonderful face, that wonderful, yes, it's been brutalized and wounded in every imaginable way. And of course, the same thing with the body, and you can see that this in the negative image. So much detail, it's quite remarkable. And so just how did that photographic negative appear on that cloth? By the way, a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. How did it appear there? The resolution of that mystery is going to give us a clue about Jesus' resurrection in glory. Hold on to that for just a moment. So, as we'll see in a moment, it coordinates perfectly with the unique crucifixion event of Jesus described in the Gospels. So the medical evidence on the shroud, the gospel evidence of Jesus' unique crucifixion, even the Roman weaponry used to torture him and to kill him ultimately with the spear wound and the whips themselves, that's Roman weaponry, etc. So you can see that this cloth is quite an amazing thing. We have many ways of dating it that I'll talk about. And it is, of course, purported to be the burial cloth of Jesus. I'll just come out and say it. I can never be 100% sure of anything, because in science you can't be 100% sure of anything, because scientists have to base their evidence on observation, right? Empirical evidence is needed, and therefore scientists can't know what they don't know until they've observed it. So there's always that problem of what we call the problem of induction. But all that being the case, I myself believe, and I'm about 99.9% sure, this is not only the burial cloth of Jesus, but gives us evidence for his resurrection in glory and evidence of his crucifixion described almost perfectly in the gospel accounts. So we better get to it. So let's take a look at, first of all, the first challenge we have to meet is the 1988 carbon dating. And as you know, this came out, it was in Nature magazine. This is a journal, a first-rate journal. It was, the shroud was given a carbon-14 dating test. A piece of thread, one single piece of thread, was removed from a very controversial corner of the shroud that had been burned during the fire of Chambéry, and that burn mark, the sample was taken from there. That sample was split into 3 parts. Each part was sent to a different carbon dating lab, including our own Los Alamos lab, of course, the one at Oxford, and one in Zurich. And they gave a test. When you combined all the test results and averaged it, they came out with this sample of the shroud, probably dated, they said, from somewhere between the 14th to the 15th century. Now, that just shut down all the scientific investigation of the shroud. Prior to that 1988 dating, there were huge numbers of investigations, including 122 different tests that had taken place over the years, most especially during the 1978 STIRP investigation, Shroud of Turin Research Project investigation, that featured many really superb scientists from around the world. Now, the point is, everything shut down. That was it. Nature's a first-class journal because it's peer-reviewed. Everybody thought there couldn't be any real problems with this. And so for 10 full years, shroud research kind of just almost disappeared. And then suddenly, we began to see that, wait, maybe all is not quite as clear as it may be. Remember that the original protocol for the shroud for the testing was that it was supposed to, the sample was supposed to be taken from 7 different places on the shroud. None of them was supposed to be from any controversial area, like a burned place. And the reason why you don't want a burned place on the shroud is because obviously burning is going to do what? Enhance the carbon-14 content in the cloth in that area where the burning took place, and a variety of other problems. But anyway, that was what happened. So Dr. Ray Rogers, who is the head of thermal chemistry for Los Alamos Laboratories, and is actually the peer review. He is the editor of the peer-reviewed journal Thermochemica. He basically got wind of this, and he was part of the 1978 STIRP investigation. So he got some of these fibrils and little fibers that were taken. In 1978, there were these sticky tapes that were utilized, and he had a series of these fibers and fibrils that came from the very precise spot where that thread had been removed in that controversial corner. He did a series of tests, as we'll see, pyrolysis mass spectrometry, a variety of other kinds of scientific tests to try and assess whether this thread could have come from the original linen. Now, why would he be doing that? Because after the fire of Chambéry, a nice set of nuns decided that they were going to patch the cloth up in the places that had been burned through using a technique called invisible mending, invisible weaving. They actually took some cotton fibers and then they dyed them with a gum dye mordant that was very close to the color of the linen, and then they sewed it in this technique. Well, if you did it that way, you could have gotten a mixture in the sample between some thread that came from the 15th century, some thread that would have come from the original linen. But the cotton content would have been the dead giveaway. The shroud is linen. There is no cotton in it except where the sisters sewed it. So here is where Dr. Ray Rogers comes in. He does the thermochemical tests, the pyrolysis mass spectrometry, and Kathleen's going to just read you the result that he obtained.
The combined evidence from chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, cotton content, and pyrolysis mass spectrometry proves that the material from the radiocarbon area of the shroud is significantly different from that of the main cloth. The radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud.
So that came 10 years later. So now what we're dealing with, right, is 10 years have elapsed, no research done, but still Nature refused to withdraw its peer-reviewed assessment. Then a team of individuals in France and Italy, run Dr. Tristan Casabianca. Tristan Casabianca, he and his team began to petition the British Museum, where the raw data from the carbon-14 dating was kept. For years, the British Museum would not give him the raw data from the three labs in Zurich and Los Alamos and Oxford. And finally, he made a Freedom of Information Act petition, like with a veiled lawsuit in the back of it. And this was like in 2019. And I mean, this is like, we're dealing with 30 years after the fact. Finally, they let the raw data go. Now, there was a very good reason why they kept that raw data a very deep, dark secret. Because when Tristan Casabianca and his team got a hold of it and did the statistical analysis of that raw data, they found so much stratification and variegation in the sample that essentially it invalidated it completely. What they found, you know, as you can see from that quote up there, which I won't drag poor Kathleen up here to read, but you can see that what Casabianca said is, you couldn't possibly use the combined evidence with all that stratification in it to conclude that this sample was taken from a fiber or a cloth that originated in the Middle Ages. It's not even remotely possible. So it has been completely debunked. That 1988 carbon dating, and of course Nature magazine, very teeny withdrawal, you know, of the data. But it appeared in Archaeometry, which is a very well-known peer-reviewed journal. And so I think that takes care of that. We need another carbon dating, and we need it from a sample that is much better dated. There's even another little possibility in the offing of why the carbon-14 content could be higher. Just wait for that until a little bit later. But right now, it has been debunked. It's impossible to date it in the Middle Ages. In the meantime, several other tests have been performed. That same fellow, that thermochemist, Ray Rogers, he did what's called a vanillin test. That's some molecular content from some enzymes that are in linen, and you can take these enzymes, and over the course of time, it decreases, and so, of course, you can pretty much make a dating test. So he made the first dating test, and that showed that the shroud had to be greater, had to come from a time before about 400 AD, at the very, very latest 400 AD, but certainly seemingly before it. Now, the reason the vanillin test could be inaccurate to a certain degree, and why you had to extend it out to 400 AD, is because, of course, the shroud was caught in a fire. Catch it in a fire, it heats up the linen. If you heat up the linen, it's going to, decrease the vanillin content accordingly. So he had to account for that, and that gives a very wide range of error. But then another fellow in Italy, Dr. Giulio Fanti, who is a very creative thermochemist and mechanical and chemical measurement expert, in Italy, he basically performed 3 tests: a Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy a test. I'd explain this to you, but basically, again, you have certain kinds of elements that decrease over the course of time, and these elements show up on a spectrum, that you can, you can measure the exact quantities of them and date it accordingly. Then he did another Raman laser spectroscopy, because the Raman laser actually excites the molecules in a slightly different way, and by doing that, you get another read to make sure that the fire, especially the carbon content from the fire did not, or the heat of the fire did not affect the residual elements. So he did it by kind of a cross-sectional analysis, and then finally he did a mechanical compressibility and tension test. When you sum up really all the values of those tests, those 3 tests that he did, basically it seems like the Shroud of Turin came from about 50 AD, plus or minus about 100 years to 200 years, with a 96% or 95% confidence level. So basically, you are dealing with a first century relic. That's what it looks like from alternative non-carbon dating. And by the way, we may have to settle for alternative non-carbon datings, because if one of the causes of the image on the shroud turns out to be what's called particle radiation, that entails complete nuclear disintegration of the entire body simultaneously, if that really is the cause of the image, then you're going to have, because of that nuclear disintegration of the cloth, it's going to give what's called a neutron flow, and the neutrons are going to start embedding themselves in the cloth. Well, what that does when those neutrons are flowing right into that cloth is, as we'll see in a moment, it does turn nitrogen and nitrogen isotopes into what? C14, carbon isotope. And so you could get an abundance of carbon, and we can prove in the future, when we have the test designed, we can show that the particle radiation hypothesis is true if a certain number of what's called cosmogenic isotopes show up on the cloth, but more on that later. The main thing to realize right now is, well, looks like the shroud came from 50 AD. Do we have any other evidence of that? Yes, we do have 3 other kinds of evidence. First of all, we've got these coins on the man's eyes. And so in order to keep a man's eyes closed during the process of rigor mortis, right, when the eyes could, come open and so forth and so on, they put little Roman leptons, or like worth less than a penny, these leptons on the eyelids of the person, and those images actually came out on the cloth. And not only did the images come out on the cloth, and this can be explained through particle radiation emanation, but you can see on those Roman leptons, you can see the insignia there. And before I get to that, I'm going to have Kathleen just read another quote, but you can see 4 enigmas in those Roman leptons that differentiate them from every other Roman lepton in every collection of Roman leptons throughout the world today. These are unique coins, and those unique coins came from what minting of those Roman leptons? A 29 AD special minting in Jerusalem by Pontius Pilate. They're sitting there right on the lids of this man. Oh yeah, a medieval forger got some of those and knew exactly what he was doing. I don't think so. But anyway, here's Dr. Alan Wenger, and he basically has a little analysis here of what he found.
We have done this by means of the polarized image overlay technique that we developed, which enables the highly accurate comparison of 2 different images and the documentation of the various points of congruence. Using the forensic criteria for matching fingerprints, we feel that there is overwhelming evidence for the identification of the images and the matches with the coins.
Those special coins minted by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. So that's one clue, again, that backs up the Fourier-transformed infrared spectroscopy and the other dating evidence. But there's a second clue, and the second clue comes from the face cloth of Oviedo. Now, many of you, we just, remember in John's Gospel, just read about it the other day. John and Peter go zooming over to the tomb when they hear that it's empty from Mary Magdalene. They come in. John gets there first and hesitates, or the beloved disciple, who I'm going to say is John. And Peter gets there and, of course, barges right on in. But what did the beloved disciple see? He saw the shroud, the linen cloth, lying in one place, and then he saw another cloth, a face cloth, rolled up in a place by itself. That rolled up face cloth was very commonly used in Jewish burial practice, particularly when someone, like in the case of Jesus, would have been, pummeled to death. So the beloved one's face is simply transformed with blood. Pleural edema fluid is pouring out of his nose. His jaw is flapping back and forth in the transportation. And of course, it looks macabre to the hilt. It's just like the terrible sight to see, especially if you had loved and honored this person. So very typically, when bringing an executed person back, they would take then this cloth and they would put it all the way around the face, then tuck it up underneath the chin, and then bring the cloth up in front, right, and all the way down across the head, down to the nape of the neck. And then they transport the body over there. Now, what's very interesting, and pay attention to this, they would then take the cloth off the face and roll it up in a place by itself, then prepare the body, then put the body in the shroud. So now, what's so important about this? Well, we think we have that face cloth of Oviedo. And we think that face cloth is in the Cathedral of Oviedo, and it has been there since about 700 AD. But interestingly enough, we have a provenance of that cloth that actually goes back to 616 AD. When that cloth was handed to this bishop, that bishop handed it to another bishop. Finally, it is handed around the year 700 to Isidore of Seville. Isidore of Seville has this special place made for it in the Cathedral of Oviedo, lays it, Saint Isidore of Seville, lays it in this special little casket for the face cloth, where it remains to this very day. It didn't get transported around like the shroud did. Now, you might say, well, what about before 616 AD? I'll explain that in a moment. But here is the point. When you compare with the same technique that Ellen Wenger used on these coins, when you use that same photographic overlay technique, that polarized photographic overlay technique, when you put the shroud face together with the blood stains on the face cloth of Oviedo, and there's, by the way, no image of a face at all on that face cloth, only blood stains. Get this. These are highly irregular blood stains from the crown of thorns, from the beatings that had taken place, all the way, to the penetration of the crowns of the thorns and the nape of the neck. When you compare them, you get 120 points of congruence. 70 of them on the frontal part of the face and 50 of them on the back side. Do you know the odds against putting two completely different cloths with a bunch of blood stains on them, highly irregularly. And remember, the face cloth of Oviedo goes around and then over. So in order to coordinate it, you got to go through conniptions to basically get the things coordinated so that the head matches with the head and the face matches with the face, etc. Now you're going to get 120 points of congruence. There's the odds against this happening by pure chance are astronomically high, unless those two cloths touched the same macabre face and head, butchered in exactly the way described by the Gospels. Why is that important? Well, if you've got a secure provenance going back to 616 AD, hey, that's really interesting. And the shroud touched the same face as the face cloth of Oviedo. I can assure you of this. The shroud has to go back to at least 616 AD. If not, way before, to 50 AD, where Giulio Fanti and his teams actually placed them with the three dating tests that I just talked about. So, what are we dealing with? Well, oh, by the way, it's not just the bloodstains that are the same. The pleural edema fluid coming out of the nose is the same. All of the fluids that are coming and pouring out of the mouth pretty much are giving rise to the same kinds of stains. No question, these two cloths touch the same face. The shroud goes back to way before, 1400 AD. Okay, all that being said, what can we conclude in the end? It looks like if we get another dating test, carbon dating test, and the carbon dating test can be legitimate because remember, we've got to worry about neutron flows actually altering the carbon-14 content in the cloth. But if we keep piling up these dating tests, we're going to find, I am absolutely sure, that Giulio Fanti is correct. It comes down to about 50 AD, plus or minus 100 to 200 years with a 95% confidence level. But let's go on further. The bloodstains. Many of you have heard and seen some of these articles that have come up in bogus science articles on the websites that this is not real blood, or that a study was done where the blood was put onto a mannequin. And then, there were sponges, that were used to stick blood stains onto the mannequin to see where this stuff would drip, but it didn't resemble the Shroud of Turin. I should hope that it wouldn't resemble the Shroud of Turin, because this is such a bunch of fake science, you can't even believe it. However, leave that for the moment. Is it real blood? Real human whole blood. Real human hemoglobin. By the way, red dyes, paints, and other chemicals don't have blood types. This has a real blood type, AB positive, same as we find in these Eucharistic miracles. I'm not kidding you. And of course, on top of that, it has real human immunoglobins. It has a variety of other definite signs, including the chemical constituents that hold the DNA profile. Now, what's interesting is that there is no real DNA profile in the chemicals that would normally be amplifiable to find a DNA profile. So you say, well, how come all the chemicals are there to constitute a double helix, yet no amplifiable profile? It's the same on every single Eucharistic miracle. I have a whole other talk on Eucharistic miracles that I can give you from Sokolka, Poland, from Tixla, Mexico, and from Buenos Aires, Mexico, overseen by Pope Francis. No DNA profile, but all the chemicals are present to hold a DNA profile. Now, you tell me how that happened. because the chemicals would also, if it was just a matter of deterioration, the chemicals should also be gone. So the whole, structure of the double helix should be gone, but why no amplifiable profile? Don't know. But anyway, I can tell you this. All those chemicals are there for DNA, and blood and stains and dyes and paints don't have it. So, is this blood? Yes, it's very, very definitely blood. But two other factors should also be considered. Number one, this blood is filled with a synthesis of creatinine and ferritin. Now, the creatinine and ferritin synthesis generally happens, yes, during a polytrauma. So did a medieval forger really get in there and go, I got to have a human subject, and I got to make sure I got a synthesis of creatinine and ferritin to make a polytrauma. So I'm going to beat the living daylights out of you before I get all this done, so I can really make sure that this blood contains, the blood of a man who's been severely tortured for hours. I don't think so, but whatever. Let's take a look at the results of the PLOS One study that was done and see the features that were discovered. And Kathleen's going to read that one.
This is not a situation typical of the blood serum of a healthy human organism. High levels of creatinine in the blood are observed in the case of strong trauma. There is a wide recent literature reporting on interaction between creatinine and ferritin in fatal accident or as a consequence of the rhabdomyolysis due to torture. This result cannot be impressed on the torn shroud by using ancient dye and pigments, as they have bigger sizes and tend to aggregate. It is highly unlikely that the eventual ancient artist would have painted a fake by using the hematic serum of someone after a heavy polytrauma.
Thank you. That's really unusual blood. It's traumatized blood, and that will become significant in a moment. Now, aside from the fact that these are absolutely real bloodstains, all right, several hundred of them that are manifest on this shroud, they coordinate perfectly with the crucifixion of Jesus. So when we compare it to the image, we look at the blood stains, we can tell what kind of a torture and death that this man in the shroud had experienced. The first thing to note is, of course, all the blood stains that I just described that are on the crown of thorns. Notice that the crown here is a crown that could have been woven by Romans. It's, by the way, the thorns are the kind of thorn, the species that can be found in Jerusalem, very long, curved thorns. And the crown is not what you would typically see in a medieval portrait or in a medieval crucifix, where it goes just around the crown of the head, but doesn't go over the top of the head. In order for the Roman soldiers to weave it in, together, they actually had to put it together with a top on the crown. And then, of course, they shove it right on the top, which, of course, just penetrates all the sensitive nerves that are at the top there of the skull, and then all around the sides. And the thorns are so long that basically when the head of the man flips back, then the thorns are literally penetrating into his neck. It's a horrible, horrible, very painful sensation that is ongoing throughout this man's ordeal. So the first thing is, why is that so special? Because there is no crucifixion. No crucifixion that we have ever found in history. Not one where it is reported that there is a crown of thorns, except for that in the gospel accounts of Jesus. That's significant. It's a unique crucifixion, and it's the unique crucifixion of Jesus. But let's go further. What we also see there between the fourth and the fifth ribs, what we see is there's very much an imprint and a pool of blood and fluid that is coming out of a hole that is going up through the 4th and 5th rib at a 45-degree angle, with pooling of blood that's there. And the wound type is a triangular wound. And that kind of wound is very typical of a legionnaires' spear with the triangular point. The reason the legionnaires carried that was when it went up into the chest cavity, the thoracic cavity, when they pulled it out, right, they would pull out all kinds of heart tissue and lung tissue along with it. The objective was to kill not only on the penetration, but on the removal of the spear. This precise triangular wound is present on the shroud at that 45-degree angle. Now, what's even more interesting about that wound, and I hate to be so clinical about it, I really do believe this is our Lord there who was killed in this fashion, but just to be clinical, it goes up into the thoracic cavity. The man, in the meantime, has been breathing very heavily, struggling for breath, almost asphyxiating, which is filling up that pulmonary cavity next to the heart, and is filling it up with a clear fluid. So when that Roman spear is pulled out, what's first going to come out is, of course, the blood that comes from the heart, the nearer organ. But then the penetration of that pulmonary sac is going to also release a quantity of built up clear fluid in the sac that will come out at the same time. And you might remember John's gospel that we read if you went to the Vigil Mass. You might remember, not to the Vigil Mass, to the Holy Saturday Mass. You might remember, to the Palm Sunday Mass, sorry. You might remember that out, as John described it, out flows blood and water. And in fact, it's such an unusual event that he says right away, hey, this was seen by a witness, and he knows that his witness is true. He was there. He knows his witness is true. And of course, why would you say that right after the blood and water incident? There's nobody, where's the water coming from? Well, there's a real source of clear liquid that's going to come out in abundance along with the blood when that spear is removed. And it would have been almost immediate that it would have gushed out. What's even more interesting, too, is that, for years and years, many people just interpreted that in, John's gospel. They said, oh, John's just being symbolic. These are the waters of baptism. He's adding in this little flourish. Isn't that nice? No, probably pretty literal. That's exactly what he saw and what he reported. But that's, again, a legionary spear. Not used at all during the Middle Ages. Nothing like that triangular head. Boy, that medieval forger looks like he's more and more informed as we get, he's remarkably talented to replicate these things and to get the precise angle of entry under the between the 4th and 5th ribs in order to invade the thoracic cavity to get the blood and water effect, the blood and clear fluid effect. Boy, what a genius. But it gets even more interesting. Now, of course, this man was beaten severely. Seemingly, there are different estimates of the number of wounds because they started to blend together. Should I be explicit? When that whipping was taking place, the whipping was occurring by means of a Roman flagrum. Now, the flagrum is a 3-thonged whip. So it's got these 3 strands sticking out, but at the end there's bone chips and metal chips that are at the ends of each of the thongs. Now what happens is you got a guy on the left who's slightly taller, a guy on the right slightly shorter, and they're beating him and whipping him at intervals. So, and those whips, right, they're rather long strands, right, so they're going around, not just hitting the back, but going around the sides and over toward the front of the abdomen there. And of course, they not only whipped him all the way from his neck, but they go all the way down to his ankles. Very typical Roman torture. But the 129 to 139 whippings, that is highly unusual. The Romans generally did not whip people that many times because they're going to lose a lot of blood. These whips were so cruel that basically they're tearing the flesh out of the back, the abdomen, the sides, the legs of the man. And so, of course, he's going to lose a ton of blood. As Frederick Zugaby actually said, he did. This man lost a huge amount of blood, which, of course, is going to accelerate his death rate. Crucifixion generally could be between 1 to 3 days, right? The longer, the better for the Romans. Just a lot more torture, which brought them, obviously, great delight. But the point is that Jesus died in 3 hours. A lot of blood loss. Now that's very interesting in itself, but remember, the medieval forger figuring out that it was a flagrum that was used. No such whip existed at the time of the Middle Ages. Single strand whips, no bone chips or metal chips. How did he figure it out? Yeah, now today we know it's the case. We found all kinds of whips at Pompeii and all sorts of other places. So clear enough. But then it gets even more interesting. There is a big, huge bulge on the left shoulder of this man. And that bulge that's there, actually, if you look at it from the vantage point of the description, let's suppose the man had a big, huge beam that was on his shoulder. If he lurched forward, let's say he was falling, and he lurched forward, as he fell to the ground, the beam would have come up and boom, just pounded down on his shoulder, either breaking the clavicle or severely dislocating the shoulder. The interesting thing is, when that happened, it would have then taken that left eye socket and pulled the eye inwards, right, and forced the neck to move to the left. These are precisely what we see in the shroud data, that one arm is longer than another arm. We see, of course, the distended arm. We see the stiffness of the neck. We see the eye socket that recedes on the left-hand side, and of course the big bulge that's very obvious on the shoulder. So that's interesting in and of itself. Again, carrying the cross seems like a remarkable correlation. Then, what's also interesting is the way the nail prints are in this man in the shroud. The nails do indeed go through the middle of the palm, but they don't go straight through the palm and out the back of the hand. Because if they had done that, the hands would just simply pull away from the nail and just would have let the body down. So what they did was they go in at a 30-degree angle and they push it down so that it'll go right through this wrist bone right here. And the wrist bone, that'll have two effects which they look for. First of all, the wrist bone would have held up the hand onto the beam, but also it goes through a whole set of nerves right here in the middle that would have been absolutely excruciating the entire time that the man is on the cross, because remember, he's got to pull himself up in order to breathe, and when he does, all those nerves are going crazy. And so essentially the man dies a horrible, painful death. Remarkably, all of it is Roman weaponry. All of it is basically corresponds to Jesus. Jesus was whipped an extraordinary number of times in order to have the proven effect that he should not be crucified, as the gospel accounts suggest. Furthermore, the nailing through the hands, furthermore, the crown of thorns unique to Jesus, the triangular spearhead that gives rise to blood and water, unique to Jesus. You start putting the pieces together. Who is this? Well, if it's not Jesus, as described in those gospel accounts, there's not another figure in history that this remotely corresponds to that we have any record of whatsoever. Truly, truly distinct. Okay, it seems like it's Jesus. Any more evidence? Much more. Here we get into the resurrection and the image formation. Now, just to give you a quick sense of things. Okay, first of all, can this image have come from any kind of a dye, any kind of a rub, any kind of a paint, any kind of a liquid, any kind of a vapor that could have been coming from the body or something of that nature? The answer is no. From a superficial test, all of which were done in 1978 in depth, we know that that image is just floating on the uppermost surface of the fibrils of the cloth. It never penetrates to the middle of the fibers. So in other words, whatever caused the image never penetrated to the middle of the fibers. Whatever caused the image never penetrated into the cloth at all. It's just sitting there on the absolute uppermost surface of the fibrils. Now, in order to produce that effect, it can't be a liquid. A liquid would have definitely penetrated into the fibers. It would have penetrated into the middle of the cloth. It would have then spread and spangled and spread into the adjacent threads that were next to where the liquid was touching, etc. So that's the first problem you've got. Is you're not going to do this with chemicals, paints, rubs, or dyes, or anything like that. Can't do it. How about scorching? Scorching is easily detectable through a technique called fluorescing. The image is not produced by scorching. Only where we see the super, fluorescing, of a scorch is down there where the sections of the cloth that were burnt in the fire of Chambéry. But the image itself, it's not there. So what are we left with at the end of the day if we're going to explain the uppermost surface of the fibrils? Basically, we're left with light. That's all we've got. That's the only natural cause that could produce that kind of a surface impression. The problem, though, there's a lot of other reasons why we need light, or what might be called radiation, light radiation of one sort or another. Now, it could be particle radiation, it could be ultraviolet radiation. I'll explain this in a moment. But radiation is going to be the cause. Another reason is that the shroud was not touching every part of the man's body, right? It was not touching fully the surface of the body. And what's really interesting is that the distance that the shroud is from, let's say, a socket of the eye or underneath the nose, where it's obviously hitting the point of the nose, but it's not hitting beneath the nose, underneath the chin, et cetera, all those distances match up with that layering effect that I talked about. In other words, the darkness of the image on the shroud, the darkness of that sepia-colored image on the shroud corresponds, right, is inverse ratio to the distance of the shroud from the body. So whether the shroud touched the body or didn't touch the body makes no difference. There's still image. And of course, it's precisely what you'd expect, a lowering of the darkness of the image in accordance with the distance away from the body. So that's, what's going to produce that? I mean, let's realistically. Only radiation. You're not going to get this from chemicals or even vapors. By the way, vapors aren't going to work. Vapors will penetrate not only into the medulla of the fiber and into the middle of the cloth, it's going to spangle everywhere. The cloth the image is going to be very, very vague and imprecise and going all over the place because vapors are not well controlled. This image is like super photographically sensitive, precise. So that's not, it's again, radiation is the only cause. And the radiation, by the way, has to be what we call directional vacuum ultraviolet radiation. If it's not directional, you cannot get that precision. So the radiation that produced it is very much a directional vertical radiation. So that's a second reason why we say only radiation will do it. Now, there's a variety of other reasons for this that I'll talk about later. But the main thing is, that's it, you guys. Light radiation is what we've got. Now, there's two basic hypotheses of how light radiation could have produced this. One hypothesis is called vacuum ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation, that, just remember, violet is violent. So, right, you just remember that if you get blue end of the spectrum, you've got very high frequency radiation, which is the kind that gives you sunburns, right, or worse. The higher the frequency, the more potent the wattage, the frequency of the radiation. So that's one theory. And that theory has been proposed by Dr. John Jackson, who, by the way, is very, very much a genius and very much has studied this problem in remarkable articles. He's published several peer-reviewed journal articles on this phenomenon, which, by the way, you can go to my website and you get the article Science and the Shroud of Turin. You can get all the footnotes to this article. These articles. Now, the main thing to notice, though, is his view is that this is super high frequency ultraviolet radiation, and if you can get it for a short enough burst. Problem with high frequency radiation is if you let it last too long, it's just going to snuff that cloth. It'll turn that cloth not only into ashes, it'll turn the ashes into a few carbon atoms that are just left scattered around. You can't leave it there for very long. Well, how long, if you have high frequency radiation like that could actually make a super precise image on a non-photographically sensitive cloth in a photographic negative, what would it take? It would take 6 to 8 billion with a B. Billion watts, like 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy. Dead bodies do not ordinarily produce 500,000 searchlights worth of light from every dimension of the body. So this is really strange. It'd have to be for 1/40 billionth of a second. Now, 1/40 billionth of a second, that's a really small fraction of time. Very, very small. So what can we do to produce that? We only have one source, and that's what we call today an ARF excimer laser. But to produce that body image, that magnitude for that short of a pulse, would require more instrumentation, and in fact, the entirety of all the ultraviolet sources of radiation in every laboratory in the world and more. 14,000 ARF excimer lasers to produce that image. Really weird. How did a dead body do that? So here is another very interesting point. In 2010, Paulo de Lazzaro and his whole team, who are in the energy experimental labs, the high energy experimental labs, they're in Italy, they actually confirmed that if you took that same ARF excimer laser and you did a 140 billionth of a second pulse, and you did it at a magnitude of 6 to 8 billion watts, would give you that same sepia-colored projection, perfect photographic negative image on a linen with the same spectral reflectance as the Shroud of Turin. And so there is experimental evidence that shows that this causative source would work and give rise to a perfect photographic negative image, but not necessarily a three-dimensional one. Hold on to that in just a moment. But Kathleen will just read you the final report that Paulo de Lazaro and his team got. It's 8 o'clock? Oh.
In 1 minute.
Okay.
The ultraviolet light necessary to form the image exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today. It would require pulses having durations shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second and intensities on the order of several billion watts.
Okay, so that's his summary statement, but if you want, all this stuff is free of charge. All the peer-reviewed journal stuff, it's all linked up there in the website if you go to my article, Science in the Shroud of Turin. Let me give you the second major theory. So the ultraviolet radiation theory is a very good one, but remember what I said. There's actual imaging and good three-dimensional layered MRI-style imaging of the interior of the body in proportion to the exterior flesh around the body. So that is also embedded in that shroud. Well, what does that mean? The body will have to turn mechanically transparent. In other words, the body has to become spiritual. Remember St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 15? He is risen as a pneumatikon soma, a spiritual body. Well, that would be exactly what happened. So in other words, as that radiation is coming out, it's not just coming from the surface of the body, it's coming from the interior of the body. And it's coming from the back and the front. And of course, it's actually three-dimensional in proportion, perfectly layered and MRI reflective that's coming. So we've got two anomalies. The body becomes spiritual, and this huge amount of light is just pouring out of it in a very precise directional way. Theory number one. Theory number two, this is particle radiation. I'm going to be very brief here. I guess I bloviated a little bit too much in the beginning. But the main thing to recognize with particle radiation is the way that you can get what's called low temperature particle radiation is if the entire body undergoes nuclear disintegration. Kid you not. So that would happen if, for example, the entire body that's in the shroud, poof, starts disintegrating, nuclear disintegration. Now, let me tell you, this is a miracle. Stable atomic nuclei in a perfectly good dead body do not undergo simultaneous nuclear disintegration on demand. It just doesn't happen. There's nowhere, we have no evidence of this ever. But it could happen. And if it did happen, what would you expect to find? First of all, you would expect to find a series of what's called heavy charged particles that would be emanating directly up and directly down. So the first thing you'd see is, right, you'd have these particles. What are heavy charged particles? Protons are heavy charged particles. Alpha particles are heavy charged particle. Deuterons are heavy charged particles. All these charged particles, they're heavy charged particles, they're zooming right up. And what are they doing when you get these heavy charged particles that are making contact with this linen cloth? What is it going to do? It is going to cause an image, a sepia-colored image, right on the very surface of the fibrils in perfect three-dimensional proportionality on the inside and the outside, the back side and the front side. That's what it's going to do. And that's a very important thing to see. And this has been proved by Dr. Katie Little over in Great Britain in the laboratories there, by Dr. Jean-Baptiste Renaudot. He actually showed it in the French laboratories. Dr. Arthur Lind, who has done it in the US laboratories. It's been proved again and again and again. This is precisely what happens in this kind of low-level nuclear disintegration. By the way, it would have given rise to a very bright light, and it would have given rise to a nice big boom, but a boom that would not have destroyed the cloth. In addition to that, you have a series of other phenomena that are explained that have bewildered scientists for years. What you get is, you also get a neutron float now. No, I forgot something really important. At the same time, the body, right, during a nuclear disintegration, you're not getting all this, just getting all this particle radiation. What else are you getting? A body that's becoming mechanically transparent. It's disappearing. Now, as that body disappears, I don't need any other explanation for the mechanical transparency of the body. The body is literally disappearing. So the interior now is just as set as the exterior. And of course, when that begins to happen, you can see that now all of the interior organs and everything, they're also undergoing nuclear disintegration, and they are giving rise to particle fluxes and flows that are coming out from a lower depth. In the case of the upper surface, are coming from a lower depth. And of course, all those things are marked. The proportionality of them is very clear because they're traveling a further distance in order to make contact with the cloth. It's a really good, comprehensive explanation. A further thing that has always mystified scientists is that none of those blood stains were smeared or damaged in any way. They were, basically, you've got about 99% of these blood stains. They came out really, really excellent shape. But if, suppose, a guy like a medieval forger wanted to replicate this whole thing and then pulled the cloth off of the body after the blood had dried, it would have damaged 99% of those blood stains. There would be evidence everywhere, smearing, all kinds of cutting, all kinds of damage to the cloth and fragmenting. None of it is there. But if the body disintegrates right out from under it, the cloth just goes poof, and that's the end of that. Not only that, but in nuclear disintegration, the bottom part of the cloth gets sucked up into the body at the same rate that the top part of the cloth is being pulled down by the vacuum that's caused by the radiation. This is a very, very good explanation. As I said before, this was not caused naturally. You can't, there's no possible explanation for all billions of atomic nuclei, stable atomic nuclei, suddenly undergoing nuclear disintegration, instantaneously and simultaneously. It's just not going to happen. But it happened in this particular case, and that requires supernatural causation. There's a lot of other things that are much more fascinating here. I do want to get to your questions, but the main thing, in order to, conclude the whole thing, and it explains a myriad of different things, but the main thing I want to do is just simply say this. This radiation, whether it's particle radiation or ultraviolet radiation, has a supernatural cause. Mechanical transparency, that is to say the body turning spiritual, mechanically transparent, that also has to have a supernatural cause. It so happens that the particle radiation hypothesis, the nuclear disintegration hypothesis, does explain everything at once. In fact, all 32 major primary enigmas on the cloth are explained by the particle radiation hypothesis, and 8 secondary enigmatic features are also explained by the particle radiation hypothesis. There's a ton of good evidence for it. If you're interested in the science, read a wonderful book by a guy named, actually a lawyer named Mark Antonacci, who put together all the scientific reports in one book called Test the Shroud. evidence for the atomic and molecular cause of the image on the shroud, something like that. But anyway, you can get that book on Amazon or something. In conclusion, this seems like a spiritual, glorious resurrection to me. It has to have a supernatural cause. I do not see how any natural cause, whether it's ultraviolet radiation or particle radiation, how that could actually occur naturally by any known scientific cause. Of course, somebody could say, we might discover all kinds of anomalous nuclear... We could. But how could we confirm this going further into the future? If there really was a nuclear disintegration of that body with the light and the boom, if there really was all this particle radiation flowing, the neutron flows as well as the heavy charged particle flows that were coming out of the body, I didn't even get into the neutron flows that were coming out of the body. If really all of this happened, what would happen also? All those neutrons which are coming out, they're going to go much further. They're going to get embedded into the cloth itself. When it gets embedded into the cloth itself, those neutrons are going to mix with N14 nitrogen isotopes that are, there's nitrogen everywhere in the linen cloth, right? So you basically, they start mixing with the nitrogen, and you're not only going to get carbon-14 buildup, right, in the cloth, you're going to get weird cosmogenic isotopes like a calcium 41 or chlorine 36, which occur only really in nuclear reactions, low temperature nuclear reactions. The next time we do a full-on scientific investigation of the shroud, what's everybody going to be looking for? Cosmogenic nuclear isotopes. If they find those there in great abundance, I assure you particle radiation is the cause. And if particle radiation is the cause, which not only explains all the primary and secondary enigmatic features on the image of the cloth and the blood in the cloth and the long-lasting nature of the cloth, etc., it's also going to explain at the same moment a supernatural cause which was light-filled and beautiful, a supernatural cause which had a boom, a supernatural cause which caused a spiritual body, as Paul would describe it, a supernatural cause that resembles the gospel accounts of the resurrection in all of their enigmas, and of course, a blood-stained image that fills us with a penetrating depth into the real torments of the unique crucifixion of Jesus as described in the gospel accounts. Yes, God did not leave us bereft of evidence. I think as we begin to get that next generation of scientific tests on this shroud, I'm almost willing to bet that these cosmogenic nuclear isotopes are going to be found. When they are found, I think it's going to give us a confirmation of just how, well, at the very least, weird, and at the very most, supernaturally caused this image is, and the true glory of the resurrection, and the true torment of the crucifixion of the man portrayed in it that resembles Jesus. Yes, God planted all of this evidence right there to wait out 2,000 years so that when a bunch of scientists were gawking at all the enigmas in this cloth, God could wink and went, gotcha. So thanks so much, everybody. I'll entertain your question right after this. Thank you very much. I think somebody will point to you for a question, or you can shout out you have a question. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Yes. Mm-hmm. And it will not have the isotopes in it. And by the way, it doesn't have an image on it either. Exactly. So the puzzle pieces are fitting together like mad. that again belongs, you're very good, but that could only give us a negative test, right? So, in other words, if the cosmogenic isotopes are not there, it wouldn't mean anything with respect to the particle radiation. What we really need to do is get to the shroud itself so we can have a positive test, see if the nuclear isotopes, the cosmogenic isotopes are there. Then we would have a very good idea that it was nuclear disintegration and low temperature particle radiation flows that were coming out. Well, that's so hard to, I don't want to go quite that far, but, that's what Katie Little thought. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, there's a question here.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two really, really good reasons for it. The first reason is if it's particle radiation, it's very low temperature particle radiation. And if it's ultraviolet radiation, it had to happen for only 1/40 of a second. But that only answers half your very perceptive question. The other part is, how come, regular old linen, give me a break. That ought to break down certainly after 200 years. The shroud is in unbelievably good shape if it was really 2,000 years old. But there is an answer to your question. If, in fact, nuclear disintegration is the cause and the particle radiation came out, it wasn't just the heavy charged particles that caused the image. A whole other set of particles, for example, neutrons that are not charged particles, they're not going to interact immediately with the surface of the cloth and stay there. That's what the heavy charged particles do. The neutrons have no charge. So they're going to go zooming right up, not only into the cloth, but they're going to go right through the cloth. Now, what's really interesting about that is in linen, you have these crystalline structures that hold the linen together that make them strong. But of course, those crystalline structures, they're between myriads of linear structures. The linear structures are very weak, but the crystalline structures, they're very strong. Now, you blast all these neutrons like you'd get right out of a nuclear disintegration of a body. You blast all those neutrons into that cloth, and what's going to happen? It's going to break all those linear links, and in the recombination, they're going to recombine with the crystalline links, and so you're going to turn that cloth into a whole series of crystalline links from those neutrons penetrating through that cloth, right? It's going to break down into multi-carbonyl crystalline links. Now, when that happens, it's going to, by the way, Dr. Arthur Lind, you read his article from 2010. I forget what the journal is, but you can find it on the website, magicenter.com. Just go to Science on the Shroud Train. But anyway, go to Dr. Arthur Lind's article, and you can see that this is going to make that cloth impervious, for example, to water, or to chemical damage, or even to the damage that would, occur over the course of time, from aging and so forth and so on. Because what you did is like you break the weak linear links, you replace them with strong, heavily crystalline carbonyl links, and what's going to happen? It's like you made a bionic cloth. You kind of made a super strong cloth. And that's why it seems to be resistant, by the way, to all kinds of things, all kinds of chemical solvents and all kinds of things. The cloth just seems to be, very, very resistant. Well, Lind actually showed that you could produce those effects in a linen cloth. And he put it in a variety of different solvents by merely using these super, neutron flows to break and reconstruct those carbonyl links. Great question, but that's another one of the enigmas solved by the particle radiation hypothesis. Perceptive, excellent question. Other questions?
I admittedly have not studied Eucharistic miracles, but do you see any theological
Yeah. Yeah, the chemicals and the structures for double helix are there. And for example, in the miracle at Tixla, Mexico, what's interesting, this guy Caston Gomez, by the way, I translated his book from Spanish. He's got these 29 super appendices with all the lab reports there. This is not available in English, but I did get translated, and I can send you my translation if you're interested in this. But the main thing is that we can identify the structures, the polymorphic structures that are there. The trouble is, none of them, when you subject them to the usual procedures for amplification, none of them gives rise to any kind of a DNA profile at all. And with the Tixla case, they were so conscious. In the Buenos Aires case, they took their time before they got it to the DNA lab. So all these people were pointing out, see, you took your time, you did this very poorly, and that's why you didn't get a DNA profile. The thing broke down. Not in Tixla. In Tixla, it was, delivered right away to a DNA lab in Los Angeles. They got all the amplification procedures ready. No amplifiable profile. Now, I don't know why that is the case, but I have a strange feeling that it's kind of like a divine intervention. I don't know of anybody who has all the DNA structures in place without an amplifiable profile. Either something is keeping it hidden, like no other. I mean, criminals, if they knew the technique for doing this, believe me, they would be utilizing it all times. But we don't know that. It's beyond our biological system. So, whether it has a theological significance or not, to me, this is my personal interpretation, it's almost like God is hiding the profile. I mean, how can the structures be there and nothing amplifiable, nothing. Zero. And by the way, this is also true for the Sepulchre Eucharistic miracle, as well as for the shroud. So very, very strange, but that seems to be the case. I couldn't explain it. Other thoughts?
In the back,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, because actually you can slow the reaction down sufficiently. So, for example, at the Dr. Kitty Little in the Harlow reactor there, outside of London, she basically, you can slow a nuclear reaction down, right? So it doesn't have to become explosive like a nuclear bomb. You can actually, almost as it were, slow the reaction down sufficiently so that it becomes a low temperature nuclear reaction. And those kinds of low temperature nuclear reactions we can produce in a lab. We generally don't see low temperature nuclear reactions in a nuclear disintegration, because most of the nuclear disintegrations we have produced have been with elements that are likely to give explosive ones. So we've been much more interested in bombs than low temperature reactions. But Dr. Kitty Little and Dr. Jean-Baptiste Renaudot, both of them showed in the British and the French laboratories, and later Dr. Arthur Lin in American laboratories, that this is certainly possible. But how a dead body would do that, the first question is, how does a dead body undergo a nuclear disintegration? That's the first thing. Every stable atomic nucleus is going to go through nuclear disintegration. Well, if it does that, which of course I think requires a supernatural cause, well, why not just say, I guess the supernatural cause made it a low temperature nuclear reaction instead of an explosive one? I have no explanation, because dead bodies just don't do that. And so low temperature, high temperature, it's equally bizarre. But you're right. You'd think, it's a nuclear reaction. Why wouldn't it just go boom? well, it's almost like God put in, as it were, nuclear rods to absorb all those neutrons, that were pounding against each other. But that's the best explanation I can give you. It's a controlled nuclear reaction. The source of the control is just as supernatural as the nuclear reaction disintegration itself.
Okay, we have another one here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Giulio Fonti certainly thinks there is. And he has been going over there to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I've got an article. It's actually from a peer-reviewed journal. It's a very bizarre article. But actually, he has showed that electronic fluxes inside the Holy Sepulchre are exceedingly strange in terms of the high frequency of those electronic signals that are coming from the tomb. And he actually has gone there in several different contexts. There's a time when you have that flame that is supposedly produced. I have not studied this. I don't want to go on record as saying that I'm a fan or not a fan of it, but I just want to say that whatever it is that's igniting that fire in the tomb, in the Holy Sepulchre, whatever it is, seems to be a highly charged electromagnetic source. And of course, everybody searched every inch of that tomb, every inch of the outside of that tomb, every possible source where you could introduce a high energy electronic signal. You just can't do one of those and not have it detectable if you're doing it from the outside going in. And so there seems to be something in the tomb that has some let's just say remnant electromagnetic high-intensity field, and that high-intensity field seems to have been generated like annually. I'm not kidding you. It's not just that it's embedded, in the rock, and so forth and so on. Low temperature radiation does not leave a strong signal, but it does leave a signal. That signal seems to be present, but then there seems to be a higher intensity signal that seems to appear annually. I don't know. I've seen it described by Giulio Fonti, and I can give you the article on it, which, of course, you can get from Science on the Shroud of Turin, MagiCenter.com. That's a great question. And apparently there seems to be both vestige radiation, remnant radiation, and there appears to be some sort of annual large amount of radiation that seems to come there and seems to be responsible for some kind of a thing that can ignite a candle wick. But again, this has got to have a lot more testing and a lot more verification before anything like that can be actually put out there for consumable, scientific data.
Well, it's almost 8:30, and I think we are ready for the reception, but we will. Anything else?
Yes, I think that Helene or Tom or somebody's going to mention the reception. But anyway, thanks again, everybody.
The ladies of Free to Be have a reception in the hall where we can continue our questions with Father. Thank you again, Father Spitzer. Very exciting.
Yeah,
It's so exciting.